Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that sounds maybe a bit dry scoping, but honestly, it's probably the single most strategic and financially impactful decision you'll make for CMMC, maybe besides the bid itself.
It really is. You might think compliance is just, ticking boxes. But for CMMC Level 2, getting that assessment boundary right, that's where you decide if this costs you a fortune or if it's even feasible.
Absolutely. Get it wrong, and you're looking at massive costs down the line, or worse, failing the assessment entirely.
Yeah, it's the absolute foundation. We're talking about organizations handling controlled unclassified information, CUI. Scope too wide, you bring in systems that has nothing to do with CUI,
Yeah.
and suddenly they need all 110 controls. Huge cost.
Scope too narrow.
Instant fail. The assessor walks in, sees CUI flowing somewhere you said was out of scope, and that's pretty much game over right there.
So our mission today is to really cut through that complexity. We're doing a proper deep dive looking at the official CMMC Level 2 scoping guide, the federal regs, like 32 CFR Part 170, all that good stuff.
Our goal is to nail down what the assessment boundary actually is, make sense of those 5 different asset categories, which can get confusing, and get really clear on the rules for cloud services and external providers, because that's a big one.
And we have to talk about the documentation, right? The system security plan, the SSP.
Oh, absolutely critical. Yeah. The SSP isn't just a description. It's like the rule book for the assessment. If your SSP is vague or you haven't justified your scope properly in there, well, the assessment's going to be painful and expensive.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Nailing the scope, that's where you start winning with CMMC. It's also, frankly, where a lot of organizations stumble and where the smart ones can save themselves a whole lot of trouble and money. All right, let's start right at the beginning. The absolute foundational rule from the guidance.
Right. The CMMC assessment scope, that boundary we're talking about, it has to be specified, documented, finalized before the assessment even starts.
So you can't sort of wing it with the assessor when they show up.
No way. It's completely non-negotiable. The organization, the OSA organization seeking assessment, you're required to have that system security plan, the SSP, fully define and justify the boundary. That's like job 1 for the assessor, checking your SSP and making sure that boundary makes sense based on your documentation.
Think of it like the blueprints for the assessment. You can't change the foundation once construction starts.
Exactly. And a huge part of drawing those blueprints is figuring out what isn't included. The out-of-scope rule. Everyone wants to minimize the burden, so what's the hard line for keeping something out?
The rule is pretty black and white, actually. An asset is out of scope only if it's physically or logically separated from all CUI assets, period.
Any connection, any path for data, any shared network segment, even shared management tools. If it can talk to the CUI environment or protects it, it gets pulled in.
Okay, physically separated, that's easy enough to picture, like an air-gapped machine.
Yeah.
But logically separated. What does that really mean in terms of tech that an assessor will accept?
Yeah, that's where the details matter. It's not just, oh, they're on different subnets. You need real verifiable controls. We're talking things like dedicated VLANs, sure, but with strict access control lists, ACLs, blocking traffic between the CUI part and the out-of-scope part.
Stuff the assessor can actually test.
Exactly. Or maybe separate security domains, different Active Directory OUs with group policies specifically preventing CUI access, maybe even dedicated virtual firewalls inside your network. The point is, it has to be enforceable and verifiable. You say it's separate, the assessor's going to poke at it to make sure.
It really drives home that this is as much an engineering challenge as a compliance one. So once you've drawn that line in the sand, everything inside the line has to be categorized, right? The guide specifies 4 categories for these in-scope components.
That's right. And understanding these 4 categories is like 90% of the scoping strategy. Everything inside the boundary falls into one of these. CUI asset, security protection asset, or SPA, contractor risk managed asset, CRMA, and specialized asset.
And the category you pick determines the assessment burden for that specific asset.
Completely. It dictates everything. Are you assessing all 110 CMMC controls against this server? Or maybe just a handful, or maybe none at all. It all comes down to which of those 4 boxes you check in your SSP and whether you can justify it. Mislabel something here and your assessment budget could explode, or you could fail for not assessing something you should have.
So this categorization step, it's not just inventory management, it's deeply strategic.
It absolutely is. You need to understand the nuances of each one. Let's walk through them because the requirements for each are different, and honestly, they're often misunderstood. #tag2. Asset categories and assessment requirements. Hashtag 2.1 CUI assets.
Okay, let's start with the most straightforward one, the CUI asset. This is the stuff that's definitely handling the sensitive information.
Exactly. If it stores CUI, processes CUI, or transmits CUI, it's a CUI asset. Think your main file server holding the contract data, the engineer's workstation with the CUI design files, the database where CUI lives, any endpoint specifically used for CUI tasks. If CUI sits there unencrypted or is processed there unencrypted, it's a CUI asset.
And for the organization, the OSA, what's the documentation requirement here?
Meticulous documentation. It needs to be listed in the asset inventory, clearly marked as a CUI asset. The SSP needs to explain why it's a CUI asset, show it on the network diagrams located within that secure CUI enclave. And critically, you have to prepare for it to be assessed against every single CMMC Level 2 requirement.
So no wiggle room on the assessment side for these. Full check.
Correct check. Assessors hit CUI assets with all 110 Level 2 security requirements. Access control, auditing, configuration management, incident response, physical security, it's applicable. The whole deal. This is the core of CMMC. Hashtag 2.2 security protection assets, SPA.
All right, moving on. Category 2, security protection assets, or SPAs. This is where things start to get a bit more nuanced, maybe offering some flexibility.
Exactly. SPAs are different because they don't necessarily touch the CUI itself, but they protect the things that do. They provide security functions for the CMMC scope.
So classic examples would be?
Firewalls, definitely. VPN gateways, your multi-factor authentication system like Duo or Okta, log analysis tools, your SIEM platform. Even an outsourced security operations center, or SOC service, could be an SPA.
The key idea being, if the SPA fails, the CUI assets are exposed, even if the SPA never held the CUI.
That's the critical distinction. They're the shields, the guard towers around your CUI assets. Documentation-wise, it's similar to CUI assets. Inventory them. Show them in the SSP diagrams, explain how they integrate. Like, how does your firewall provide boundary protection? How does your MFA tool plug into your identity system?
And the assessment requirement. It says prepare to be assessed against level 2 requirements. Does that mean all 110 again?
No. And this is the crucial cost-saving part of the SPA category. Assessors only look at the level 2 requirements that are relevant to the capabilities the SPA provides.
Okay, unpack that. If it's a firewall.
Right. A firewall doesn't need awareness training controls applied to it directly. It doesn't handle media sanitization. So the assessor focuses on controls relevant to a firewall, things like access control, who can manage it, system and communications protection, the firewall rules themselves, maybe some audit and accountability. It's a subset of the 110.
So if you have, say, a cloud-based SIEM service acting as an SPA, analyzing logs.
It gets assessed on things like, is it logging properly? Is access controlled? Is the system protected? But probably not on physical security controls for the data center. That's the cloud provider's job, usually covered by their certs. Or user training controls if no humans from the provider are directly involved in your specific service delivery beyond setup. It targets the function.
That makes a huge difference in assessment scope and cost. What about physical security gear? You mentioned cameras, badging systems. If they protect a facility where CUI is handled, they're SPAs.
Absolutely. Physical security is a required control family in CMMC. So if your security camera system covers the CUI area or your badge reader controls access to it, that system is an SPA.
And the assessment.
Again, focused on relevant controls. For cameras. Is the video data available when needed? Is access to the DVR or the cloud storage restricted? How is that video data protected? Things like that. They aren't CUI assets, but they're protecting the environment where CUI assets live.
Now, the big question for cloud-hosted physical security. If my badge system or cameras are managed through a commercial cloud service, does that service need FedRAMP?
No, provided it's only acting as an SPA. If it's just storing access logs or video feeds, which we'd classify as security protection data or SPD, and not storing, processing, or transmitting CUI itself, then FedRAMP is not required for that cloud service.
That's a massive potential cost saving right there, using a standard cloud provider for security functions without triggering the FedRAMP mandate.
It's a critical clarification in the guidance, yes. As long as CUI isn't involved in that specific service, it's treated as an SPA, assessed on applicable controls, no FedRAMP needed. Hashtag 2.3 Contractor Risk Managed Assets, CRMA.
Okay, category 3. This one feels different. The Contractor Risk Managed Asset, or CRMA. This sounds like the DoD explicitly saying, okay, we'll accept some risk here.
That's exactly what it is. And yes, it was quite controversial when introduced. A CRMA is an asset that could technically process, store, or transmit CY because maybe it sits on the same flat network segment.
So it's not physically or logically separated.
Correct. It's not required to be separated.
Mhm.
But the key is it's not intended to handle CUI, and that intention is backed up by documented, enforced security policies, procedures, and practices.
Why? Why allow systems that could touch CUI to sit right next to it without the full separation?
Honestly, it was a practical conception to the reality of many small and medium-sized businesses in the defense industrial base, the DIB. Lots of them run on older, flat networks.
Mm.
Re-architecting everything into perfectly segmented CUI enclaves would be prohibitively expensive, potentially driving them out of defense work entirely.
So the thinking was maybe 90% of the devices in a small shop, the accountant's laptop, the marketing database, the front desk PC, they never actually need to touch CUI.
Right. And forcing all 100 devices into the full CMMC Level 2 assessment just because they share a network switch, that would make CMMC impossible for many. The CRMA category is basically the government saying, okay, for Level 2, we'll let you manage the risk for these non-CUI systems through policy and basic security hygiene, rather than forcing costly segmentation everywhere. It's a compromise.
A compromise that saves potentially huge amounts of money for the organization, avoiding assessment fees and hardening costs for maybe dozens or hundreds of devices.
Astronomical savings, potentially. And it's a big but. The organization is taking on significant risk.
The risk of lateral movement.
Exactly. If an attacker compromises a CRMA, say, through a phishing email on that accountant's laptop, and that laptop is on the same network as your CUI server, well, there's no network segmentation to stop them from trying to jump across. You're betting your internal policies and basic security, like endpoint protection on the CRMA, are good enough.
It's a cost saving now versus potential security breach later. And we absolutely have to stress this CRMA category. It vanishes at CMMC Level 3.
Poof. Gone. At Level 3, if it's not physically or logically separated, it needs all 110 controls, full stop. So Level 2 organizations using CRMAs need to see it as a temporary measure, potentially.
Let's talk assessment. The guidance says OSAs must prepare to be assessed against CMMC Level 2 security requirements for CRMAs. But you just said they're generally not assessed against the 110 controls. That sounds contradictory.
It does. It's confusingly worded. What it means in practice is the assessor primarily reviews your documentation for CRMAs. They look at your SSP, your policies, your procedures. Do you have clear rules saying CUI is forbidden on these systems? Do you have basic security practices documented for them, like patching, malware protection?
So if the paperwork looks solid...
If the documentation is good and the policies seem reasonable and enforced, the assessor generally doesn't test the CRMA directly against the 110 controls. However,
here comes the catch.
here's the catch.
Yeah.
If the documentation seems weak, or if during interviews something raises a red flag, maybe someone casually mentions storing work files on their CRMA desktop, sometimes the assessor can perform a limited spot check.
Okay, what does a limited spot check involve, and why is it potentially so dangerous for the OSA?
It's limited, meaning it shouldn't blow up the assessment time or cost significantly. The assessor might pick a few CRMAs at random and just check one or two basic things that the OSA claimed they were doing in their policies. For example, the policy says all CRMAs have up-to-date antivirus. The assessor checks 3 machines, finds one where it's disabled or hasn't updated in months.
And that one failure.
That one failure can be catastrophic because the entire justification for the CRMA category rests on the trust that the OSA is following its own risk management policies. And that spot check proves the policy isn't being followed. It calls the entire CRMA designation for that asset, and potentially others, into question. It's like pulling a thread that unravels the whole thing. Did CUI actually end up on this machine if basic security wasn't even running? It opens a Pandora's box and could force a much deeper, more expensive look at those assets, potentially reclassifying them as CUI assets needing full assessment.
High stakes indeed. Do what you say you do in your policies, especially for CRMAs.
Absolutely critical. Hashtag 2.4 specialized assets.
All right, category 4, specialized assets. This feels like another risk acceptance category, but maybe for different reasons than CRMAs.
Exactly. This isn't about saving money by avoiding segmentation. It's about dealing with assets that do handle CUI, but for technical reasons simply cannot be fully secured to meet all 110 CMMC controls.
What kind of systems fall into this bucket?
Think industrial IoT devices on a manufacturing floor, specialized operational technology, OT systems that might be running ancient proprietary software, government-furnished equipment, GFE, where the government tells you how to configure it, and maybe that configuration isn't CMMC compliant. And the classic example, Legacy test equipment or restricted information systems still running Windows XPs because replacing it would cost millions and require recertifying an entire production line or weapon system.
So the government is knowingly allowing, say, Windows XP systems to be part of the CUI lifecycle.
If properly documented and managed as a specialized asset, yes, it's a major risk acceptance. But the rationale is that the cost, or sometimes the sheer technical impossibility, of replacing or fully securing these specific assets outweighs the risk, provided that risk is actively managed through other means.
And how is that risk managed? What does the OSA need to document?
Again, meticulous documentation is key. Inventory the asset. Explain in detail in the SSP why it cannot meet standard security requirements. Then document the specific risk mitigation strategies. This usually involves heavy isolation, putting it on its own dedicated, highly restricted network segment or VLAN, maybe even requiring physical key access to operate it. Strict maintenance procedures, physical access controls. The network diagram must clearly show its limited controlled connection points to the rest of the CMMC environment.
And the assessment, does the assessor try to test controls on the Windows XT box?
No. For specialized assets, the assessor reviews the SSP documentation thoroughly. They check if the justification for the designation is sound, if the risk mitigation strategies are documented, and if they seem reasonable given the circumstances. But they do not assess the specialized asset itself against the CMMC security requirements. The documented risk management plan is what gets reviewed, not the asset's compliance. Hashtag tag 2.5 out-of-scope assets.
Okay, finally, the simplest category conceptually, out-of-scope assets.
Right. These are the assets that cannot store, process, or transmit CUI, and they don't provide any security protection like an SPA would to the CUI assets.
And the critical requirement is?
They must be physically or logically separated. No ambiguity there. Think your guest Wi-Fi network, employee personal devices, usually, the general administrative network if it's carefully segmented off.
But there's a really interesting and useful exception mentioned in the guidance regarding virtual desktop infrastructure, VDI. How can VDI help keep endpoints out of scope, even if they access CUI?
Ah, yes, the VDI exception. This is a potential game changer for remote access or BYOD scenarios. An endpoint device could be a thin client, a personal laptop, whatever, that hosts a VDI client, can be considered out of scope if the VDI environment is configured very strictly.
How strictly?
The VDI must be set up so it only provides keyboard, video, and mouse streams to the endpoint. All the processing, all the data storage, all the CUI interaction happens within the secure VDI server environment, which is in scope and assessed. Critically, the VDI configuration must prevent CUI from being stored or processed locally on the endpoint.
So things like disabling copy-paste from the VDI to the local machine.
Exactly. Blocking clipboard redirection, disabling local printing from the VDI session, preventing mapping of local drives into the VDI session. Essentially, you turn the endpoint into a dumb terminal. It's just a window into the secure environment. The CUI never actually lands on the endpoint itself.
Which means you could, theoretically, allow someone to access the secure CUI environment from their personal laptop at home, and that laptop wouldn't need to meet CMMC requirements itself.
Correct. If the VDI is configured and locked down properly, the endpoint stays out of scope. The OSA's job, of course, is to provide the documentation, the VDI configuration policies, technical settings, to prove to the assessor that CUI cannot spill onto that endpoint. If you can justify it convincingly, that endpoint is out. Hashtag tag 3, security protection data, SPD.
Okay, we've touched on this term a few times, especially regarding SPAs and the FedRAMP rules. Let's formally define security protection data, or SPD. What is it exactly?
Right, SPD is basically data that's generated by or used by your security protection assets to do their job. It's not the CUI itself, but it's data that's relevant to the security of the CMMC environment.
Give us some common examples.
Sure. Configuration files for your firewall or your SIEM, log files, system logs, audit logs, security logs generated by CUI assets or SPAs, results from vulnerability scans, alerts from intrusion detection systems, and importantly, things like credentials, passwords, API keys, certificates that grant administrative access to manage the in-scope environment. All that is SPD.
Now, the million-dollar question that comes up. Does SPD need the same level of protection as CUI? If my SIEM logs, SPD, are stored in a commercial cloud, does that cloud need FedRAMP just like it would if it held CUI?
And the answer, according to the official rule, 32 CFR 170, is generally no. SPD by itself does not automatically inherit all the protection requirements of CUI.
So how is it treated?
If the system handling the SPD is classified as a security protection asset, SPA, like that Cloud SIEM example, Then that SBA is assessed only against the applicable CMMC controls relevant to its function,
Mm.
log protection, access control, availability, etc. It doesn't automatically need all 110 controls just because it holds SBD, nor does it automatically trigger a FedRAMP requirement if it's cloud-hosted.
That's a really important clarification. It prevents a massive, perhaps unnecessary escalation of compliance costs for systems that are handling security data, but not the CUI itself.
Exactly. The protection level is matched to the data's security relevance and the function of the asset holding it, not automatically jumping to the full CUI standard. Hashtag 4, defining the CMMC assessment boundary.
Let's zoom back out a bit and think about the assessment boundary as a whole concept. It's clearly not just about drawing network lines on a diagram. What does the official guidance say the boundary encompasses?
It's much broader than just technology. The boundary includes all the people, systems, and processes involved in storing, processing, or transmitting CUI or protecting it. It's an operational bubble, not just a network bubble.
So definitely the IT infrastructure, servers, workstations, network gear, but also the people using it, the policies they follow.
Yes, and the cloud services they use, the physical locations, the facilities where CUI is handled or stored, and crucially, any external service providers, ESPs, that are involved in that CUI lifecycle or the protection.
If any of those elements, people, process, tech facility provider, touch the CUI or protect it, they're inside the boundary.
That's the rule. They have to be accounted for in your SSP and your assessment scope.
And it seems obvious, but let's state it clearly. The size and complexity of that boundary directly impacts the assessment itself, right? The cost, the time it takes.
Oh, absolutely. Exponentially. A bigger, more complex boundary means more things for the assessor to examine. Think about a company with just one office, one simple network, everything on-prem. That's one scope.
Now compare that to a company with, say, 3 different sites: HQ, R&D lab, manufacturing floor. Maybe they use different physical security at each. Maybe HQ runs Windows, R&D runs Linux, and the factory floor has specialized OT systems. Maybe they use AWS GovCloud for some things, M365 GCC High for email, and still have some legacy on-prem servers.
Right. Each variation, each different system type, each facility, each major cloud provider
Right.
adds complexity. The assessor has to verify the CMMC controls are met consistently across all those different pieces, the integration points, the different management teams potentially. It just balloons the time, effort, and inevitably the cost of the assessment.
Which brings us back to that strategic point you made earlier. It's not just about architecting your environment. You almost have to architect your assessment, making conscious decisions about how you define that boundary to manage risk and cost.
Precisely. Do you try to get everything assessed in one giant complex assessment? That might seem efficient, but if one small part fails, the entire certification attempt fails. High risk.
The alternative.
Segmenting. Maybe you create a very clean, well-defined CUI enclave for your core contract work. Get that assessed and certified first. It's smaller, less complex, lower risk of failure. Then, maybe later, you tackle bringing a separate, more complex manufacturing network or a legacy system into a different assessment scope.
So multiple smaller assessments.
Potentially. It allows you to phase your compliance, manage risk in chunks. The downside is you have to prove that segmentation is real and effective, back to those robust logical and physical separation controls we talked about. You need clear boundaries documented in the SSP for each assessment scope. It's a trade-off between holistic assessment cost and segmented assessment risk management. Hashtag Tech 5. Steps and techniques for defining the boundary. Hashtag Tech 5.1. Defining the process.
Okay, so you've made that strategic choice about how you want to approach the assessment architecture. Now, the tactical work, what are the concrete steps to actually define that boundary and get it documented correctly in the SSP?
It needs to be a systematic process. The guidance basically outlines 5 key steps.
Yeah.
Step 1, identify ingress and egress. Where does CUI come into your organization and where does it go out?
That goes in says and goes out says, as you put it.
Exactly. Is it coming via a secure government portal, encrypted email, a physical hard drive couriered over? You need to know all the entry and exit points.
Yeah.
Step 2, map the flow. Once it's inside, how does that CUI actually move around? Which people, systems, tools touch it?
And this is where you said IT sometimes doesn't have the full picture.
Oh, frequently. Mapping the flow requires talking to the business process owners, the engineers, the program managers, the QA folks. IT knows the official servers, but they might not know that an engineer downloads a file, emails it, hopefully securely, to a colleague, who then uploads it to a specific project management tool and maybe prints a copy. You need to trace the actual path, the spaghetti diagram, not just the theoretical one.
What's the most common surprise you find during that mapping? The thing IT totally missed?
Honestly, unsanctioned storage or sharing, people using personal cloud drives for convenience, putting CUI snippets in collaboration tools that aren't approved, emailing it internally without proper encryption because it's just internal, or the classic, printing it on a shared network printer and leaving it there. The map has to reflect reality, warts and all.
Okay, so identify ingress, map the real flow. What's next?
Step 3. Inventory. Make a comprehensive list of all the system components involved in those flows: servers, workstations, laptops, printers, scanners, cloud services, software applications, network devices. Step 4. Categorize. This is critical. Take that inventory and assign each item to one of the CMMC scoping categories we discussed: CUI asset, SPA, CRMA, specialized, or confirm it's truly out of scope.
And the final step.
Step 5. Document and diagram. Pull it all together. Refine your network boundary diagrams. Clearly show the segmentation. Write the justifications in your SSP for why each asset is categorized the way it is. This documentation package is what the assessor works from. Hashtag 5.2, including facilities and ESPs.
Let's double-click on two areas that often get fuzzy: facilities and external providers. First, facilities. If CUI is handled in a building, that building is in scope.
Correct. If CUI is stored, processed, or discussed, say, in engineering meetings, on the production floor, in the secure server room, that physical space falls within the assessment boundary.
And the documentation needs to cover the physical security controls for that space.
Yes. Your SSP needs to describe how you're meeting the CMMC physical security, PE, controls for that facility. That includes perimeter security, fences, guards, gates maybe, facility access controls, locks, badge readers, visitor logs, and protections for physical media and equipment within the space, locked cabinets, secure disposal.
You mentioned earlier that CMMC is flexible on how you meet controls. So for facility access, I don't necessarily need an expensive biometric scanner. A clipboard and a locked door could work.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
CMMC focuses on the outcome. Is access controlled? Is there an audit trail? A well-managed sign inside-out clipboard for visitors and long doors drawers for CUI can meet the requirement if that's what your documented policy says you do,
Okay.
and you actually follow it consistently.
Consistency is key.
Absolutely. The problem arises if your SSP claims you have sophisticated electronic access control everywhere, but the assessor shows up at the loading dock and finds just a clipboard and maybe an unlocked inner door. The inconsistency between your documented policy and your actual practice is the failure, even if the clipboard method could have been acceptable if documented and followed properly.
Got it. Now, external service providers, ESPs. This includes managed service providers, MSPs, managed security service providers, MSSPs, consultants. When do they get pulled into my CMMC assessment scope?
There are two main triggers. One, if the ESP handles CUI directly. For example, if your MSP hosts your CUI file server in their data center or manages the backups containing CUI. Two, if the ESP provides security protection for your in-scope assets, for instance, an MSSP monitoring your firewall logs or a consultant managing your vulnerability scanning tool.
So if they touch CUI or touch the things protecting CUI, like handling SPD, they're potentially in scope.
That's the general rule. If they do neither, like an MSP that just handles your basic HR email system, which never sees CUI or security data, then they're likely out of scope for CMMC purposes. Hashtag 5.3 key documentation artifacts.
Okay, pulling this together, what's the essential documentation package an OSA needs to have ready on day one of the assessment related to scope?
It's a coordinated set. First, the core system documentation. Your detailed system boundary diagram, clearly showing the CUI enclave, segmentation points, and where different asset types live. Plus the matching asset documentation, the comprehensive asset inventory with every asset categorized: CUI, SPA, CRMA, specialized, out of scope, and justified.
What about cloud services?
Critical. You need Cloud FedRAMP documentation. For any cloud service handling CUI, you need proof it meets FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. That means the FedRAMP authorization package, or if claiming equivalency, the full independent assessment report proving it.
And for all those external service providers?
This is often a weak spot. You need ESP documentation, a complete list of every ESP involved. Crucially, you need their contract details, and most importantly, a customer responsibility matrix, CRM, for each one that's in scope.
The CRM that details who does what for each CMMC control rate. Vendor responsibility, shared responsibility, your responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. And you need this CRM finalized and ideally signed off before the assessment starts. If your ESP doesn't have a standard CRM, many smaller ones don't, you, the OSA, might need to draft one based on the services they provide and get them to agree to it. Showing up to the assessment without CRMs for your key providers is a major red flag, potentially a phase 1 failure.
That sounds like a heavy lift, getting vendors to formally agree to specific control responsibilities.
It can be, which is why vetting vendors for CMMC readiness, including their willingness to provide a CRM, is so important before you rely on them for CUI or security functions. The final piece is the flow documentation. That CUI data flow map we talked about, showing the complete lifecycle entry, storage, processing, exit, including physical outputs like printers or USBs. And it all needs to line up the flow map, the asset inventory, the boundary diagram, the SSP narrative. It has to be a consistent story.
Let's spend a bit more time on that CUI flow mapping. You've stressed its importance. Why is physically drawing out how CUI moves so vital to getting the scope right?
Because it's the practical validation of your entire scoping strategy. If you just list assets, you might miss things. Mapping the flow forces you to think about the connections, the transitions, the people involved. It helps you. 1. Solidify the boundary. Does the flow ever cross into an area you thought was out of scope? 2. Visualize CUI movement. Makes it easier to explain to assessors and your own team. 3. Support SSP development. The map directly informs how you describe your environment. 4. Reveal risk points. Where are the riskiest transitions? Where could data leak? 5. Enable inheritance planning. Shows exactly where ESPs or CSPs plug into the CUI lifecycle.
If you can't draw the map, you probably don't fully understand your CUI environment.
Pretty much. It's the reality check.
So what are the best techniques for actually finding all the places CUI might be hiding, especially those shadow IP spots?
You need a multi-layered approach. Don't just rely on IT's view. First, review the contracts. What data types does the contract actually require you to handle? Look for flow-down clauses, DD-254s, for classified context, anticipating similar CUI guidance. This tells you what CUI you should have. Second, interview everyone. Talk to engineering, IT, QA, program management, contract, shipping, receiving, legal. Ask them to show you their workflow with CUI or potential CUI. Where do they click? Where do they save? Who do they send it to? Third, use technology. Run scans. Use data loss prevention, DLP tools, or content discovery solutions, CDS, if you have them. Scan file servers, SharePoint sites, email systems, and critically scan endpoint devices, laptops, desktops for keywords, CUI markings, specific file types common in your work, like CAD files, technical data packages.
That scanning part sounds potentially noisy. Lots of false positives from keywords.
It can be, yes. Just searching for CUI might hit policy documents. You need smarter scanning, looking for patterns, metadata, proximity to other sensitive terms. And again, don't just scan servers. CUI often ends up copied locally to workstations or put onto USB drives. You have to look there too.
Okay, interviews, scans, what else?
Fourth, analyze cloud usage. Where are people really collaborating? Check usage logs for sanctioned and unsanctioned cloud storage, consumer Dropbox, Google Drive, ERP systems, backup solutions. Is CUI accidentally synced somewhere? It shouldn't be. Fifth, track the physical. Where do prints go? Are there secure shred bins? How are physical media like USB drives controlled? Walk the path of a physical piece of CUI.
Once you've found all these potential locations and flows, how do you represent it visually in a way that helps with CMMC?
The map needs detail and clarity.
Clearly mark the entry and exit points you identified.
Show all the storage locations, servers, cloud drives, databases, maybe even specific shared mailboxes, and ideally color code or label them by their CMMC asset category, CUI asset, SPA, etc.
Identify the processors, not just systems, but the roles, departments, or specific ESPs, CSPs that handle the CUI at each stage.
Know where CUI goes for long-term storage, archives, backups, and any physical outputs.
Use standard flowchart symbols or a clear visual language to show the direction of flow. Critically superimpose your defined CMMC assessment boundary onto this map. It should be immediately obvious where CUI lives, how it moves, and where the protected perimeter is.
Let's take that email example again. Say an organization decides its regular corporate email, like standard Microsoft 365 commercial, is out of scope to avoid the cost of GCC high. What does that CUI flow map need to show, and what are the policy implications?
Okay. If standard email is out, the flow map must show that CUI never enters or leaves via that system unencrypted. The policy has to strictly forbid users from sending or receiving CUI directly in that system.
So how do they exchange CUI electronically?
The map would need to show CUI only flowing through approved in-scope channels. Maybe that's a secure government portal, like PIE. Maybe it's a dedicated CMMC-compliant secure file transfer solution. Or maybe users are trained to encrypt CUI using FIPS 140-2 validated cryptography before attaching it to a standard email.
But But if they encrypt it first, send it via standard email, and the recipient decrypts it on their machine.
Then the system used to perform the decryption and subsequently process the plaintext CUI. That system is now, by definition, a CUI asset and must be in scope and meet all the requirements. You can't just use encryption as a magic wand to make scoping issues disappear. The point where CUI becomes readable plaintext is key. That system needs protection. Hashtag Tech 7. Cloud and External Service Provider ESP considerations. Hashtag Tech 7.1 defining ESPs and CSPs.
Scoping gets really tangled when third parties are involved. Let's nail down the definitions. What exactly is an external service provider and ESP in the CMMC context?
The official definition is pretty broad. An ESP is any external entity, could be people, technology, or even facilities that you use to provide or manage IT or cybersecurity services. If those services involve processing, storing, or transmitting CUI or security protection data, SPD.
So it covers a lot. MSPs, MSSPs, cloud hosting providers, even some consultants if they manage security tools or access CUI.
Right. It's focused on who handles your sensitive data or manages your security posture externally.
Is there an exception for, say, staff augmentation? If I hire a contractor from an MSP, but they just sit in my office, use my laptop, log into my network, are they an ESP?
Generally, no. If the contractor is essentially acting as your employee, using only your equipment, accessing only your systems, following your policies, and crucially not taking CUI or SPD back to the MSP's own environment, then they typically wouldn't be considered an ESP under CMMC scoping. They're just part of your workforce, covered by your SSP.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, how is a cloud service provider, a CSP, different from a generic ESP?
A CSP is a specific type of ESP. They're an ESP that offers cloud services built on the standard cloud model, things like on-demand resources, broad network access, resource pooling. Think infrastructure as a service, iOS, platform as a service, Panaphore, or software as a service.
So your big names, Microsoft Azure M365, Amazon Web Services, AWS, Google Cloud Platform, those are CSPs.
Exactly. Especially their government-focused clouds like M365, GCC High, or AWS GovCloud, which are relevant here. Hashtag Tag 7.2 assessment rules for ESPs and CSPs, 32 CFR Section 170.3.
Okay, the federal rule, 32 CFR Section 170.3, lays out how these ESPs and CSPs fit into your CMMC assessment depending on what data they handle. Let's break down the scenarios. Scenario 1, the provider handles CUI, maybe along with SPD.
This is the most restrictive rule. If the provider handles CUI, if that provider is a CSP, like AWS Microsoft, that cloud service must meet FedRAMP moderate baseline requirements or equivalent. No exceptions. If you're storing CUI in AWS S3, that S3 service needs to be FedRAMP moderate authorized or running in GovCloud, which is. If the provider is not a CSP, maybe it's your local MSP hosting your CUI server in their building, then their services related to that CUI are considered part of your CMMC assessment scope.
Well, hang on. So if my local MSP hosts my CUI server and they aren't FedRAMP authorized, which most aren't, my CMMC assessor has to go audit the MSP's environment against my CMMC controls.
That's what the rule implies, yes. Your assessment boundary extends to include the relevant services provided by that non-CSP ESP handling your CUI. You, the OSA, are responsible for ensuring those services meet the CMMC requirements, which likely means the assessor needs visibility into the MSP's operations, security, maybe even their physical facility.
That sounds incredibly difficult and expensive, both for the OSA and the MSP, who might not want an external auditor poking around their multi-tenant environment.
It is, and that's precisely why the strong recommendation, almost a practical necessity, is to use FedRAMP moderate authorized CSPs whenever CUI is stored or processed in the cloud. It simplifies the assessment significantly because the FedRAMP authorization provides a baseline level of assurance. Using a non-CSP for CUI hosting basically means you're signing up to potentially pay for auditing their environment too.
Okay, huge point there. Now, scenario 2. The provider handles only SPD, no CUI involved, like that Cloud SIEM example.
Much simpler. If they only handle SPD, logs, configuration data, etc., it doesn't matter if they're a CSP or a non-CSP ESP. In either case, their services are treated as a security protection asset, SPA, within your scope. Meaning they are assessed, but only against the applicable CMMC controls relevant to the security function they provide, like log integrity, access control to the logs. And crucially, FedRAMP is not required just for handling SKD.
Got it. In scenario 3, the provider handles neither CUI nor SPD.
Then they don't meet the CMMC definition of an ESP that impacts your scope, they're out. Your standard business SaaS tools for HR or marketing, if they never touch CUI or security logs, are not part of your CMMC assessment.
Let's quickly revisit the encrypted backups. I encrypt my CUI with FIPS 142 validated crypto. I store the encrypted blob in standard AWS S3, not GovCloud. Does that S3 bucket need FedRAMP?
According to the official DoD position, as stated in the rule, preambles, and guidance, yes, it still does. Their stance is that CUI, even when encrypted, remains CUI. Therefore, any CSP environment storing that encrypted CUI must meet the requirements for storing CUI, which means FedRAMP, moderate, or equivalent.
Even though the provider can't read the data.
Even so, the requirement is tied to the presence of CUI data, encrypted or not, within the CSP environment. It's a point of contention in the industry, but that's the current rule you have to plan for. Hashtag 7.3 control, inheritance, and accountability.
So let's say you do the right thing. You use a FedRAMP moderate CSP like M365 GCC High for your CUI. That means you inherit all the controls and you're done, right?
Oh, absolutely not. That's a huge misconception. Using a FedRAMP service is necessary, but it's just the start. The Customer Responsibility Matrix, CRM, is where the reality hits.
Explain the CRM again.
The CRM is a document provided by the CSP, or that you develop with an ESP, that details for each CMMC control, or the underlying NIST 800-171 controls, who is responsible. Is it the provider, is it you, the customer, or is it shared?
And for something like GCC High, which is highly compliant, surely Microsoft handles most of it.
They handle a lot, especially the physical infrastructure security, the underlying platform hardening. But if you look at Microsoft's CRM for GCC High against NIST 800-171, the customer typically retains full or shared responsibility for something like 80% of the controls.
80%. So I still have to implement, manage, and document controls for things like
Access control, managing user accounts, permissions, access reviews, awareness, and training your users, configuration management, configuring the service settings securely, incident response, your plan for handling incidents within the service, media protection, how you handle data exports, system and information integrity, monitoring, vulnerability management of your configurations. The list goes on and on. The CSP gives you a secure building. You still have to furnish it, set the rules, lock the doors, and train the occupants.
So the key takeaway is, even when using a top-tier FedRAMP cloud service, the ultimate accountability for meeting CMMC requirements never shifts from the organization seeking certification, the OSC.
Never. You, the OSC, retain ultimate accountability. You have to implement your share of the controls defined in the CRM. You have to provide evidence to the assessor that you're doing it. You need to ensure the CSPE is actually doing their part as claimed. You can outsource the technology, but you absolutely cannot outsource the compliance responsibility or the risk. Hashtag 7.4 OSC documentation responsibilities.
Okay. Wrapping up the provider section, what's the final checklist of documentation the OSC absolutely needs to have ready regarding cloud and external providers?
It boils down to four main things.
Identification. A clear list in your SSP of all cloud systems and ESPs that process, store, or transmit CUI or SPD or provide security functions.
Verification. For any cloud service handling CUI, the documentation proving it meets FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. The authorization package or equivalency assessment.
Oversight. The finalized customer responsibility matrix, CRM, for each in-scope provider. Cross-reference in the SSP to show how shared inherited controls are managed, plus contracts and SLAs.
Readiness. You need all of this. The list, the FedRAMP proof, the CRMs, the contracts readily available. The assessor will ask for it, likely during phase 1 of the assessment, to validate your scoping and inheritance claims. Don't wait until the assessment to try and gather it.
Preparation is everything here. If you can't produce that documentation quickly, it undermines the assessor's confidence in your entire program.
Exactly. It suggests you haven't done your due diligence on your supply chain risk, which is a core part of CMMC, hashtag tech outro.
Wow, okay. That was a seriously deep dive into CMMC Level 2 scoping. We've really unpacked those 4 in-scope asset categories: CUI assets, the critical security protection assets, or SPAs, the controversial contractor risk-managed assets, or CRMAs, and the technically tricky specialized assets.
And we spent a lot of time on the why behind them, especially how SPAs and CRMAs represent this complex balancing act between achieving robust security and acknowledging the cost and technical realities faced by the defense industrial base, particularly smaller businesses.
We also defined that assessment boundary isn't just networks, it's the people, the processes, the facilities, the external providers, and stressed just how vital that CUI flow mapping exercise is to get it right.
and hammered home the rules for cloud. CUI in the cloud generally means FedRAMP moderate is your requirement, but even then, that CRM shows you the organization are still on the hook for the vast majority of the control implementation and evidence. Accountability stays with you.
I think the biggest takeaway for anyone listening is that scoping isn't just some technical drawing you hand off to IT. It's a fundamental business strategy decision. Every choice you make about where that boundary line sits, how you categorize assets, how rigorously you enforce separation, it directly dictates your audit complexity, your costs, and ultimately your ability to get and keep defense contracts.
Absolutely. If you can invest the effort up front to truly understand your CUI flow and then architect your systems to logically or physically separate everything that doesn't strictly need CUI access using those VLANs, ACLs, maybe VDI, effectively, you will dramatically reduce your CMMC burden down the road. It's strategic pain now for tactical gain later.
Which leads to maybe a final thought to leave folks with. CMMC Level 2 allows these non-FedRAMP SBAs. It accepts the risk of CRMAs, all arguably to keep the defense supply chain, especially smaller players, viable. Is this current Level 2 framework with these compromises truly creating the secure environment the DoD ultimately wants? Or is it just a necessary pragmatic bridge, a calculated risk the government is taking until the entire DIB can mature to a higher security baseline?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? And for now, the answer doesn't change the fact that you, the organization seeking certification, are the one carrying the immediate risk. Your scoping decisions aren't just about passing an audit. They're about managing your actual cybersecurity posture in the face of real threats within the framework the government has set. Choose wisely.